Welcome to Silent Queen's Rise. I'm glad you're here. Now let's get into the story. He brought his girlfriend to her mother's retirement ceremony. He held her hand in the front row, in the seat that had been reserved for family. 3 feet from where Renata had spent 31 years, building a career that quietly funded everything he had ever called his own. He smiled at the colleagues who recognized him. He accepted congratulations on Renata's behalf, as though the achievement were somehow adjacent to him. What he did not know, what no one in that auditorium knew except the company's general counsel and the woman being celebrated at the podium, was that the separation agreement had already been signed. The asset transfer had already been executed. The thing he had been maneuvering toward for 2 years had already been removed from the board. Conrad Bellamy believed he was watching his wife's final performance. He believed the ceremony was a courtesy, a graceful exit by a woman whose relevance had peaked. He believed that within 60 days, he would have what he came for. His name on the house in Georgetown, half the investment portfolio, and a clean separation from a woman he had long since stopped seeing as a person, and had begun treating as an obstacle between himself and the life he believed he deserved. He was wrong about everything. This was not Renata's ending. This was the last page of his. He simply had not been told the story was over. Chapter 1. The woman at the podium, her name was Renata Colwell. To her husband, to his colleagues, to the Washington social circuit they moved through in tailored jackets and careful opinions. She was simply Renata, the composed one, the woman who remembered everyone's name, who sent handwritten notes after dinner parties, who managed the household accounts and her husband's calendar and her own demanding career with an efficiency so quiet that most people mistook it for effortlessness. She was 42. She had spent the last 11 years married to Conrad and the last 16. Before that, building a reputation inside the federal contracting world that very few people outside of it fully understood. She was the deputy director of strategic acquisitions at a defense consulting firm called Whitmore Aldridge Group. The work was unglamorous in the way of all genuinely powerful work. No cameras, no profiles. Contracts that ran to 8 and 9 figures, negotiated over months in rooms with no windows. What Conrad had never known, what Renata had never volunteered, was that she had been offered a partnership stake in Whitmore Aldridge Group 7 years into their marriage. Not a salary, not a title, a stake. 12% of a privately held firm with government contracts across 4 federal agencies and annual revenues that placed it in a category Conrad had no framework for. She had accepted. She had structured it through a holding entity her attorney established for the purpose. She had not hidden it from Conrad in the legal sense. She had simply never mentioned it in the emotional sense, the way you don't explain the load-bearing walls to a guest who has never once offered to help you move furniture. Conrad was a senior associate at a lobbying firm. He was very good at seeming indispensable. He wore suits that cost more than the monthly mortgage payment on their first apartment and spoke at dinner parties with the authority of a man whose relationship to power was primarily decorative. He had married Renata in year 3 of her career, before the partnership, before the contracts. When she was still building, when she still sometimes doubted herself out loud in a way. He found endearing because it made him feel necessary. He had stopped being necessary around year 4 of the marriage. He had not noticed, because Renata had continued performing the architecture of a relationship in which he still mattered. She cooked Sunday dinners. She attended his firm's holiday parties and remembered the names of his colleagues' spouses. She managed their joint checking account, paid the bills, handled the insurance renewals, scheduled the contractors, and, for the first 6 years, convinced herself that the distance between what she gave and what he acknowledged was a gap that intimacy could eventually close. It couldn't. It was a geography, not a gap, and by year 7, she had stopped trying to cross it. Chapter 2. The husband Conrad Bellamy had grown up in a family where ambition was performed rather than executed. His father had talked about the novel he would write. His mother had talked about the restaurant she would open. Neither had happened. Conrad had inherited the vocabulary of aspiration without the discipline it required, and had compensated, for his entire adult life, by surrounding himself with people whose actual achievement he could treat as reflected light. Renata had been the brightest source of that light. He had known it even when he courted her, had understood on some level that her stillness contained something he could not replicate, and had told himself that what he felt was admiration when it was closer to appetite. By year 5, he had stopped pretending. He began treating her career as background. He described her work at dinner parties with the vague imprecision of a man who had never asked her a specific question about it. He referenced her salary, which he believed was substantial but not extraordinary, when it was convenient, and ignored it when it was not. He spent freely. He contributed minimally. He accumulated credit, professionally and socially, for a life that Renata had built and maintained almost entirely alone. He had been seeing Amber Vesey for 14 months when Renata found out. Amber was 31, worked in public relations, and had the specific energy of a woman who had decided that proximity to an older, successful man was a reasonable substitute for building something herself. Conrad had met her at a conference in Chicago. He had told Renata the conference had run long. He had told Amber that his marriage was effectively over. Both statements were calibrated lies. The truth was that Conrad had been watching Renata's career reach what he had correctly intuited was an apex, and he had begun planning accordingly. Chapter 3. What the father taught her. Renata's father, Eugene Colwell, had been an accountant for 38 years. He had never earned more than a modest salary. He had never owned anything that could be called an asset by the standards of the world his daughter eventually moved through. What he had owned was clarity. He died when Renata was 36, 2 years into her partnership at Whitmore Aldridge. He died in the bedroom of the same house he had lived in for 40 years, with Renata beside him and her brother on the phone from Denver because he couldn't get a flight in time. In the last coherent conversation they had, Eugene said something that Renata had been turning over in her mind for 6 years since. He said, "A person who never asks what things cost is either very wealthy or very certain someone else is paying. The first is rare. The second is dangerous. Conrad has never once asked you what your work actually requires. That means he's decided the answer doesn't matter. And a man who decides the answer doesn't matter has already decided that you don't matter. Watch for when he starts counting what he thinks he's owed. That's when you'll know the calculation has already begun." Renata had sat beside her father's bed and listened and filed it. 2 years later, Conrad hired a divorce attorney. Renata already knew. She had known for 11 days before he made the call, because the attorney Conrad had chosen had once represented a contractor in a dispute with Whitmore Aldridge, and the legal world in Washington was smaller than people assumed, and Renata's general counsel had flagged the conflict and quietly mentioned it to her over coffee. One Thursday morning, she thanked him. She went back to her office. She closed the door. She sat for 4 minutes. Then she picked up her phone and called the person she called whenever the architecture needed reinforcing, her own attorney. A woman named Vera Okafor, who had been practicing asset protection law for 26 years, and who had, 7 years earlier, structured the holding entity that housed Renata's partnership stake with a kind of foresight that looked like paranoia until the day it looked like genius. Chapter 4. The discovery. Renata found the first evidence of Amber on a Saturday morning in February. She was not looking. She was using Conrad's laptop to print a document because her printer was out of ink, and a message notification appeared on his screen before she could look away. It was from a contact saved as AB Work, which was not a work contact Renata recognized, and the preview contained 3 words that were not professional in any register. She looked at the screen for 6 seconds. She printed her document. She returned the laptop to the desk exactly as she had found it. She went to the kitchen and made coffee, and stood at the window looking at the frozen garden, and allowed herself exactly 1 full minute to feel what she was feeling. Then she began documenting. She was methodical because she had been trained by her career to be methodical, because due diligence was not a concept she applied selectively, and because her father had raised her to believe that emotion was information, not instruction. What she felt told her what was true. What she did about it was a separate decision. Over the following 8 weeks, she assembled a record, credit card statements she had always had access to because she managed the joint accounts, hotel charges, dinner charges, a weekend in Annapolis that Conrad had described as a work retreat, a florist charge in March, flowers she had never received. She cross-referenced the charges against Conrad's calendar, which she had also always had access to because she had always managed it. She identified 14 discrepancies in 3 months. She called Vera Okafor on a Tuesday evening in April and said, "I need to talk about the structure." Vera said, "I know. I've been watching the joint accounts. He moved $8,000 last week into a personal account I wasn't aware of." Renata closed her eyes. "When did he open it?" 4 months ago." She breathed. "Is it enough to establish a pattern?" "Not yet. Give him time." Men like Conrad always believe they're operating at a level of sophistication the other party can't detect. He'll do something larger, something definitive, and when he does, we'll have everything we need. Renata hung up. She made dinner. She set the table for two. She listened to Conrad describe his day, and asked the right questions, and smiled at the right moments, and said nothing about the April hotel charge or the florist, or the $8,000, or the attorney, or the conversation she had just had in the driveway of a house that Conrad believed was worth fighting for. He didn't know the house was the smallest thing on the list. Chapter 5. The architecture Vera Okafor spent the next 10 months in the structure. She was not building from scratch. She'd been building this for 7 years, since the day Renata had called her after the partnership offer and said, "I need to make sure that whatever I build, I can carry out the other side of this marriage intact." She had asked that before she had any evidence of what Conrad would eventually become. She had asked it because her father had taught her to read the difference between a person who was present and a person who was accounting. And Conrad had always been accounting. The partnership stake at Whitmore Aldridge had never been commingled with marital assets. It sat inside a holding structure under Renata's premarital legal identity, a technicality that had taken 4 months to establish correctly, and that Vera had described at the time as the most important 4 months they would spend together. She had been right. The Georgetown house was jointly owned, but Renata had contributed 92% of the down payment from premarital savings, a fact documented in records Vera had maintained since year one. The investment portfolio, Conrad believed, was marital property was, in its majority, funded by distributions from the partnership stake, which were themselves protected. What Conrad's attorney would find, when he finally began preparing discovery, was a financial landscape in which the visible assets, the house, the joint accounts, the modest brokerage, were real but represented a fraction of Renata's actual position. And in that fraction, his client's behavior over the previous 18 months had created a paper trail of financial misconduct that would significantly alter any conversation about equitable distribution. Vera had documented all of it. The personal account Conrad had opened, the transfers, the expense patterns inconsistent with his stated income, the consultation with a divorce attorney, while marital assets were still being commingled. Each item was logged with the precision of a woman who had spent 3 decades protecting wealth from people who believed it was owed to them. Then something happened that changed the timeline. Renata's retirement was announced. It was not a retreat. It was a restructuring of her role. She was stepping back from day-to-day operations at Whitmore Aldridge to chair a newly established federal advisory board, a position that carried no salary, significant influence, and, as a condition of her transition, a buyout of a portion of her partnership stake that was valued at a number she had not yet said aloud to anyone except Vera. Conrad read the announcement in the Washington Post's business section on a Thursday morning. He read it 3 times. He looked at the number. He picked up his phone and called his attorney. He believed the retirement meant vulnerability. He believed she was stepping down, stepping back, losing leverage. He believed the buyout meant there was money moving, money that could be characterized as marital income, money he could claim a share of. He accelerated. He contacted his attorney the same day and instructed him to begin formal proceedings. He wanted the house. He wanted a claim against the retirement buyout. He wanted it structured as urgently as possible. He believed he was moving before Renata had time to protect herself. He did not know that the protection had been in place for 7 years. He did not know that Vera had been anticipating this exact maneuver. He did not know that the retirement, the timing, the announcement, all of it had been coordinated with precision. He did not know he had just walked through a door that would lock behind him. Chapter 6. The retirement ceremony, was held on a Thursday afternoon at the firm's offices in downtown Washington. The lobby had been cleared and arranged with chairs and a small podium. The guest list was 200 people. Colleagues, federal clients, partners from other firms, a deputy secretary from the Department of Defense, 3 members of the advisory board Renata was about to chair. Renata stood at the podium in a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, a single strand of pearls, and the composure of a woman who had been performing calm under pressure since she was 34 years old. She spoke for 8 minutes about the work, about the people she had built things with, about what public service required from the people willing to give it. She did not look at Conrad once. Conrad arrived 20 minutes into the ceremony with Amber beside him. Amber wore a dress that was appropriate for a different kind of event. She held Conrad's arm. Her chin was at an angle that communicated something she intended to communicate, but that read, to everyone who had known Renata for more than 3 years, as a miscalculation of the room. The room noticed, the particular silence of people who know exactly what they're seeing moved through the audience like a current. Several of Renata's colleagues exchanged glances. The deputy secretary from Defense looked at Conrad for 2 seconds with an expression that had no warmth in it. 2 of the senior partners stepped slightly closer to each other. Conrad found 2 seats near the back. He sat down. He watched Renata at the podium. He watched her receive a standing ovation from 200 people who understood, in a way he never had, what she had actually built. He watched this with the expression of a man who believed he was watching the last of something. He was. He just had the wrong person in mind. After the ceremony, Conrad approached Renata in the reception line. He had Amber with him. He extended his hand, which was a gesture so tone-deaf that 2 people standing nearby actually looked away. Congratulations, Renata. A long time coming. Renata looked at his hand. She looked at Amber. She looked back at Conrad. She shook his hand, because it was a professional event with 200 witnesses, and she had not survived 16 years in federal contracting by making unnecessary scenes. Thank you for coming, she said. Her voice was the voice of a woman completing a formality. She turned to the colleague beside her and continued the conversation she had been having. Conrad stood there for 3 seconds with Amber on his arm, and the distinct sensation of having been dismissed in a language he didn't have the vocabulary to respond to. He interpreted this as shock, as numbness, as the passive acceptance of a woman who had no moves left. He was making the final error of his life, and he didn't know it. Chapter 7. The weeks after Conrad's attorney filed the formal separation documents on a Monday, Conrad moved out of the Georgetown house the following Friday, into an apartment in DuPont Circle he had already arranged. Because he had been planning this for longer than he had admitted to anyone, including Amber, he texted Renata from the parking lot. Moving out today. I think we both know this needed to happen. Renata read the message. She set her phone on the kitchen counter. She made tea. She sat at the table where she had eaten breakfast alone more mornings than she had counted, and looked out at the garden and did not feel what Conrad expected her to feel. She felt the specific, structural calm of a woman who has prepared for a thing so thoroughly that its arrival is almost administrative. 2 days later, Conrad's attorney submitted an initial discovery request that included, among other items, a demand for documentation of the retirement buyout from Whitmore Aldridge Group. He believed this was his leverage. He believed the buyout was marital income. He believed it was the number that would change everything. He was right that it was the number that would change everything. He was wrong about the direction of the change. The same week, Conrad did something his attorney would later describe, in a voice from which all professional composure had drained, as the single most consequential financial decision his client had made in the entire proceedings. He withdrew $47,000 from the joint investment account. He transferred it to the personal account he had opened 18 months earlier. He did this without Renata's knowledge or consent. He did this because he believed the account was marital property, and he was entitled to half of it. He did this because he had been told by no one credible that moving money before a settlement was finalized was standard practice. It was not standard practice. It was documented financial misconduct during pending divorce proceedings, and the joint investment account was monitored, had been monitored for months, and the transfer was logged in real time and forwarded to Vera Okafor's office before the business day was over. Vera sent Renata a single encrypted message that evening. He moved the money. Renata replied, "How much?" $47,000. She sat with that for a moment. That's what my father said he would do. Your father understood the pattern. This is what it looks like when someone mistakes access for ownership. Is it enough? Combined with the 18 months of documented behavior, the undisclosed personal account, the altered expense patterns, and the timing relative to the filing. Yes, more than enough. When we walk into that room, he will not be negotiating from a position of strength. He will be explaining himself, and there is a meaningful difference between those 2 postures. Renata looked out the window at the garden. The first spring bulbs were beginning to break through the soil, small green points of insistence pushing up through the cold. Schedule the meeting, she said. Chapter 8. The conference room. The meeting took place on a Wednesday morning in late April. The offices of Okafor and Associates occupied a floor of a building near Farragut Square. The conference room had tall windows and a long table, and the specific quality of air that exists in rooms where significant decisions are made and then never discussed publicly. Conrad arrived. He wore a suit he had not worn since a particularly important client dinner 3 years ago. He was accompanied by his attorney, a man named David Sperling, who specialized in high-asset marital dissolution and who had told Conrad repeatedly and with confidence that the retirement buyout represented the most recoverable asset in the marital estate. David Sperling had not yet seen Vera Okafor's file. He had not yet learned that his client had been living, for the past 11 years, inside a financial architecture he had never had any claim to. He had not yet understood that the woman he had been preparing to negotiate against had spent 7 years with the help of one of the more formidable asset protection attorneys in Washington, ensuring that when this moment arrived, the math would be irrefutable. David Sperling was about to have a morning he would discuss with colleagues for years. Renata arrived at 9. She wore a dark blazer, a cream blouse, and a single strand of pearls. No other jewelry. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was the face she had worn for 16 years of federal contract negotiations. Neutral, present, unhurried. Vera entered behind her. She was 61, wore reading glasses on a chain, and carried a briefcase that was older than most of the furniture in the room. She had the specific authority of a person who has stopped needing to perform authority because the record speaks for itself. She set the briefcase on the table. She did not smile at anyone. Conrad leaned back in his chair. He looked at Renata with the expression of a man who believed the room was a formality, a signature, a number, a clean exit. Renata didn't look at him. She sat down. She folded her hands on the table. David Sperling opened with the prepared position. The marriage had broken down irretrievably. His client sought equitable division of marital assets, including the Georgetown property, the joint investment portfolio, and, significantly, the retirement buyout payment from Whitmore Aldridge Group, which his client's research indicated was substantial, and which, having occurred during the marriage, he argued was subject to equitable distribution. He said the last part with weight. He said it as though it were the architecture of his entire case, which it was. Vera listened without expression. When David finished, she opened her briefcase and removed a folder. She placed it on the table without ceremony. "Thank you, Mr. Sperling. Before we discuss distribution, I need to correct several factual assumptions underlying your client's position." David nodded. Conrad shifted once in his chair. Vera opened the folder. "The Georgetown property. Your client believes this is jointly held marital property. It is jointly titled, which is not the same thing. The down payment was 92% funded from premarital personal savings of my client, documented in full at the time of purchase and maintained in our records since. In any equitable distribution analysis, this funding history is dispositive. Your client's claim to the property is substantially smaller than his expectation." David's pen paused above his notepad. "The joint investment account at Meridian Capital. Your client transferred $47,000 from this account to a personal account on April 9th, without my client's knowledge or consent, 11 days after the formal separation filing. Under District of Columbia law, this constitutes dissipation of marital assets during pending proceedings. The transfer, the timing, and the intent are documented. We will be filing a counterclaim for full recovery of the dissipated funds plus applicable damages." Conrad's jaw tightened. He looked at David. David did not look back. "The personal account your client opened in October of last year, 18 months, into what he had characterized to his personal contacts as a marriage that was effectively over, was not disclosed during initial discovery. It received, over its existence, a total of $63,000 in transfers from joint funds. We have the records." She paused. She turned a page. "Now, regarding the Whitmore Aldridge Group retirement buyout." She looked directly at Conrad for the first time. Her gaze was steady and contained nothing decorative. "Your client's position assumes that the buyout is marital income. I need to correct that assumption to the level of its foundation." She placed a second document on the table, a single page, facing Conrad and David. "My client holds a 12% partnership stake in Whitmore Aldridge Group, acquired in year 7 of the marriage through a holding entity established under her premarital legal identity and funded exclusively from premarital personal capital. The stake has never been commingled with marital assets. It has never appeared in any joint account. It has never been disclosed to your client because it was under no legal or ethical obligation to be." She let that settle. The retirement buyout represents a partial liquidation of that stake. The stake is not a marital asset. The buyout is not marital income. Your client has no claim to either. She placed a third document beside the first two. The total value of my client's position at Whitmore Aldridge Group, inclusive of the remaining stake after the partial buyout, is currently assessed at approximately $14 million. This figure has been accumulating for 7 years inside a structure your client had no awareness of and no participation in building. The room was silent. David Sperling stared at the third document. His face did what faces do when the number is not what the entire case was premised on. Conrad stared at the paper, and then at Renata, and then at the paper again, and the color performed a slow, visible retreat from his face. 14, he said. It wasn't a sentence. Vera continued without acknowledgement. Your client's total legitimate claim against the marital estate, after accounting for the down payment, contribution history, the dissipation counterclaim, and the exclusion of the partnership assets, is substantially smaller than he entered this room expecting. Our offer is the vehicle, the personal furniture, and a one-time payment of $6,500, representing his equitable share of the joint checking account balance as of the date of filing. David set down his pen. He turned to his client. His expression carried the particular exhaustion of a man who had been given an incomplete map and has just discovered the terrain. Conrad, I need to speak with you privately. Conrad did not move. He was looking at Renata. He was looking at her the way a person looks at an optical illusion after someone has explained the trick, with the disorienting recognition that the image has not changed, only his understanding of it. You knew, he said. His voice was flat, not accusatory, just factual, in the dull way of a man arriving late to a fact that has been true for years. Renata looked at him. I knew, she said. I knew about Amber. I knew about the personal account. I knew about David before David knew about me. I knew about the Chicago conference and the Annapolis weekend and the florist charge in March for flowers that were not brought to our house. She paused. My father told me, when I was sitting next to him in the last week of his life, that a man who never asks what things cost has already decided someone else will pay. You never once asked me what my work required. Not in 11 years. You attended my events and accepted introductions and described my career to dinner parties with the vague authority of someone who had never asked a single specific question about it. Her voice was level, not cold. Something more precise than cold. You brought your girlfriend to my retirement ceremony. You sat in the front row and held her hand in a room full of people who had worked alongside me for 16 years, and you looked at me at that podium, and you thought you were watching me diminish. She stood. She picked up her bag. You weren't. You were watching me close a chapter I should have closed 4 years ago. And the only reason it took this long is that I wanted to leave with everything that belonged to me intact. She buttoned her jacket. Vera's office will send your client the settlement terms by end of day. He has 5 business days to respond. Given the counterclaim exposure, I would recommend he respond promptly. She looked at Conrad one final time. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the specific expression of a woman who has finished something that needed finishing. Take care of yourself, Conrad. She walked out. Vera followed, briefcase in hand without looking back. The conference room held its silence. David Sperling gathered his notepad. Conrad sat at the mahogany table and looked at the documents that remained, at the numbers that had reordered his entire understanding of the last 11 years, at the empty chair where his wife had sat, and understood that the vacancy had not been created today. It had always been there. He had simply never looked. Chapter 9. The unraveling Conrad's life restructured itself with the thoroughness of a system that has had its central support removed. The first week, the settlement. David Sperling called him on a Friday morning to confirm what Conrad had already accepted in the conference room, which was that there was nothing to negotiate. The terms stood. He signed. He received the vehicle and the furniture and the $6,500, and no further claim against anything Renata Colwell had built. The second week, the apartment. The DuPont Circle unit was not the apartment of a man in transition. It was the apartment of a man who had planned his exit from a marriage the way you pack for a trip, assuming you can return for anything you've forgotten. He had furnished it with confidence. He had told Amber it was temporary, a staging ground. Amber had believed him for a while, because he had been very consistent in his presentation, and she had not yet had reason to verify the underlying facts. She had reason now. The third week, the firm. Lobbying work operates on relationships, and relationships in Washington operate on reputation, and Conrad's reputation had absorbed, in the weeks since the ceremony, a kind of damage that is invisible until it is everywhere. A senior partner he had lunched with quarterly stopped returning calls. A client referral he had been expecting was quietly redirected. Nothing dramatic, nothing documentable. The industry simply recalibrated around new information the way water finds a lower level. By the fourth week, Amber had done the math. She was 31 and sharp, and had been attracted to a specific version of Conrad Bellamy, a version that required the infrastructure Renata had been providing for 11 years. Without the house in Georgetown, without the social access, without the quiet organizational competence that had made his life run smoothly enough to project ease, what remained was a man in an expensive apartment he could not afford on his current trajectory, with a girlfriend who had understood, by the end of April, that she had been shown a set rather than a home. She told him on a Sunday evening, plainly and without cruelty, that she thought they were in different places and that she wished him well. Conrad sat in the apartment afterward for a long time. He had the expensive furniture. He had the vehicle. He had the $6,500 and a lobbying practice that was quietly losing altitude. He had no house, no wife, no girlfriend, and no access to the infrastructure that had made him seem like the person he had performed being for the last 11 years. He had nothing he had built himself. There had never been nothing before. There had always been Renata under it. Chapter 10. The Advisory Board. 8 months after the divorce was finalized, Renata Colwell took her seat as chair of the Federal Advisory Board on Acquisition Reform. The first meeting was in September. The chamber was in a federal building 2 blocks from the Capitol. 12 people around a table, each of them with significant experience in procurement, contracting, or policy. Renata opened the session. She set the agenda for the next 18 months. She spoke for 20 minutes about what reform actually required, which was not new legislation but institutional will, and she described the path toward that will with the methodical precision she had spent 30 years developing. At the end of the meeting, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the one who had attended the retirement ceremony, and looked at Conrad with an expression that had no warmth, leaned across the table and said, "I've been waiting for someone to say exactly what you just said for about 6 years." Renata smiled. She said, "Then let's make sure we don't spend another 6 years waiting." In November, the Washington Post magazine ran a profile. The headline was, "The Architect Nobody Saw Coming." The piece described her years inside Whitmore Aldrich, the partnership, the federal contracts, the advisory board. It described her approach to power, which a colleague quoted as, "She never needed the room to know she was running it. The room always found out eventually." The profile did not mention Conrad. It did not need to. People who moved in their shared circles read it and understood everything the piece did not say. In December, the firm's communications team used a photograph from the advisory board's first public session for a feature in a federal contracting publication. The photograph showed Renata at the head of the table, composed, present, without performance. Conrad saw it in January. He was in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the lobbying office, on his laptop, applying for a position at a smaller firm that had expressed cautious interest. The publication was on the counter, one of those trade journals that accumulate near the door of every coffee shop with a professional clientele. He picked it up. He turned to the feature. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He looked at the woman at the head of the table, the composed one, the one who had made his dinners, and managed his calendar, and attended his holiday parties, and sat quietly in every room, the one he had described with vague authority for 11 years, without ever asking her a real question, the one he had brought a girlfriend to stand beside at her own retirement ceremony, because he believed she was already peripheral. He set the journal down. He drank his coffee. He looked at his laptop and the application he had been filling out, and the carefully revised resume that began with the lobbying firm from which he had not been asked to leave, but from which he had quietly understood his future was limited. He thought about what it meant to spend 11 years standing in a structure you did not build, and assuming it would always hold, assuming the person maintaining it would always maintain it, assuming that the silence was permission and the patience was permanence. He had been wrong about both. He had been wrong about all of it. The coffee went cold. He submitted the application. He gathered his jacket and walked out into the January air and did not look at the journal again. Chapter 11. The morning after everything in March, 7 months after the finalization, Renata drove to her father's house. The house was in Fredericksburg. Her brother had been managing it since Eugene died, and they had agreed. Not yet. When the question of selling came up. Because it was the kind of house that required consensus neither of them had been ready to reach. It was a small house, nothing remarkable from the outside, with a kitchen that smelled like coffee, even when there was no coffee, and a back porch that caught afternoon light in a specific way that Renata had been trying to reproduce in every subsequent home without success. She sat on the porch on a Saturday morning in early spring. The dogwood in the yard was beginning to think about blooming. The coffee was good. The birds were sorting out their territories with a focused urgency of creatures who understand that timing is everything. She had her phone with her. On it was the folder she had maintained for 3 years. Statements, receipts, screenshots, timestamps. The complete documentary record of 18 months of Conrad's behavior, assembled with the methodical care of a woman who had been taught by her father that evidence was not anxiety dressed up. It was clarity made tangible. She opened the folder. She went through it once, slowly. Not to revisit the pain of it, which had already done its work and moved on, but to confirm that nothing remained worth preserving. Then she selected the folder. She pressed delete. She confirmed. The screen cleared. She set the phone down. She picked up her coffee. She looked at the dogwood and thought about her father. She thought about the last real conversation they had, the one about people who never ask what things cost. She thought about the 7 years she had spent building something carefully enough that when the person who had never asked could not reach it, that was not an accident. That was the point. She had not been planning a divorce for 7 years. She had been planning a life that could survive one. That was a different thing, and the difference mattered, because one came from fear, and the other came from clarity. And her father had spent 38 years trying to teach her the difference between the two. She thought she had finally learned it. The morning stretched out around her, unhurried and specific, the way good mornings are. She was not angry. Anger had been useful once and had been retired with appropriate ceremony. She was not sad, though sadness visited sometimes, in the evening, in the particular register of grief that has nothing to do with loss and everything to do with the years spent not yet seeing clearly. What she was, sitting on her father's porch with coffee in a mug that had been in this house since before she was born, was complete. Not because the divorce had validated her, not because the settlement had rescued her, not because the profile or the advisory board or the photograph had announced her, because she had spent 11 years managing a life that was built on her labor, and she had finally, methodically, without drama, removed herself from it. And the thing she had built for herself had held. It had held through everything Conrad had thrown at it, and it had held through everything she had feared might happen, and it had held simply because it had been built to hold. That was what her father had actually been teaching her. Not how to protect herself from a specific person, but how to build things that do not depend on being seen to stand. She finished her coffee. She set the mug on the railing. She looked at the dogwood and the morning light and the small yard her father had maintained for 40 years, with no audience and no applause, and complete fidelity to the work itself, she thought. I know how to do that now. And she thought that was enough. That was, in fact, everything. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. New stories arrive every week for the women who build quietly and leave on their own terms. The next one is already written.